There are 3 stages of demonic possession. The first is manifestation and infestation. This is when a demon makes itself known through insidious ways, such as pretending to be a loved one, or sometimes a little girl. The second stage is oppression. This is when the demon systematically breaks down the victim's resistance through physical assaults, such as bites, scratches, and sleep deprivation. The third and final stage is full possession. By now the victim is hearing voices telling them to harm others or themselves. The demon's goal is to drive the host to commit a mortal sin that will condemn their soul to hell.
I would watch her get ready for work, and the whole time I'm thinking, I just want to hurt her. I want to stab her.
One evening in the mid-1800s, Charles Finney was suddenly alerted to the sound of frantic banging on his front door. He opened the front door, and stood before him was a panicked mother, holding a young girl, no older than 6, in her arms. He rushed the two into his house, and after an examination of the girl's abdomen, his worst fears were confirmed. The young girl's appendix was about to burst. If this happened, the resultant infection would be fatal. With no time to lose, he placed the young girl on a surgical bed and prepared her for surgery. In his haste to begin the operation, he forgot to administer the anesthetic. The young girl's screams of agony and fear filled the house as he held her down and cut into her. Finally, she passed out from the pain. He knew something was wrong, and when he looked down at the young girl, her lifeless eyes stared accusingly back. Too young to understand the torture she endured in her final moments, her spirit would haunt the house for years to come. But the nature of her death would summon an entity far darker and dangerous than anyone could have ever imagined. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home, the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. It's another stormy night, so make yourself a drink and snuggle up under a warm blanket as we prepare to explore the terrifying story of the Sallie House haunting. It was New Year's Eve in 1992. Tony and Deborah Pickman looked at their 2-story house and smiled. This would be their first house as a married couple, the perfect place to start the new year. But more importantly, the perfect place to welcome a new addition to the family. Deborah ran her hand instinctively over her burgeoning baby bump and sighed contentedly. But as they gazed upon their new home, there was a latent evil staring back at them from within. Tony stared in stunned silence at the toy animals, placed in a perfect circle in the centre of the nursery. Until now, he'd been able to dismiss the strange occurrences as just being in an unfamiliar house. But this was something truly unexplainable. When they first moved in, he didn't notice anything odd. But after a few weeks, the strangeness began. It started with the electrics. Light bulbs flickered and buzzed, even when turned off. The oven would turn on by itself, and the cordless phone would intermittently lose and regain power. But as it was an old house, Tony put it down to faulty wiring. What he found harder to explain was the sudden and strange behaviour of the animals, particularly when they were near the nursery. One time, while watching TV, he noticed the cat seemingly staring at something unseen. floating over the heads of he and Deborah. In the context of what had been happening, it was creepy, but it was the dog's reaction to the nursery that first told him something was wrong. It was the middle of the day, and Tony heard the dog barking and snarling with an aggression that was completely out of character. He ran upstairs, thinking there was an intruder, and found the dog staring at the entrance to the nursery. Its hackles were raised, but when he went into the nursery, no one was there. The only thing that felt wrong was the gust of cold air as he entered the room, and the dog's sudden whimpering as it brushed past him. By the time their son Taylor was born in June, Tony had forgotten about the strange events, but the new life in the home seemed to give energy to the strange phenomena. A strange mould grew on household items, and the baby was constantly waking in the night. While Tony knew babies could be fussy, he couldn't help but notice that as soon as they settled Taylor down and started to relax, the baby would be awoken. It was as if something was intentionally waking the baby to tire them out. The constant nighttime interruptions took a toll on the couple, and Deborah's sister Karen stayed over to help. One night, after coming home from visiting family, Tony went upstairs to use the bathroom, and he instinctively peered into the nursery. On the floor were the toy animals, placed in a circle in the middle of the nursery. He called out to Deborah, and she and Karen released a collective gasp when they saw the formation of toys on the floor. They tried to dismiss it as a prank, but the only person who'd been in the house was his sister Jeannie, and this didn't seem like the kind of prank she would pull. And when he called her to check, she told him what they already knew. It wasn't her. But she also told him something else. When she came round, she felt uncomfortable and experienced a strange, cold feeling when she went upstairs. This feeling intensified when she entered the nursery, and she left straight after. Tony suddenly remembered feeling the exact same sensation when he heard the dog barking outside the nursery. They tidied the toys away and went downstairs. But before they reached the bottom, Karen turned and froze. Tony followed her gaze. The lights were back on. When they looked in the nursery, they saw the scruffy teddy bear that had been sat on a wicker chair, now laying on its back, perfectly placed in the centre of the room. Deborah picked up the toy and checked for strings or anything that could have moved it, but found nothing. Tony placed the bear back on the chair and turned out the light. They all slept in the same room that night. The next day, Tony called his parents and arranged for his family to stay there while they figured out what to do next. It was while Tony was putting Taylor in his car seat as they prepared to leave that he felt a sudden burning sensation run down his back. Initially, he thought it was a bug bite, but by the time he got to his parents, the pain was getting worse. He asked Deborah to look at it, and when she did, her face went white. There were 3 long, deep scratches running down the centre of his back. This would be a sign of things to come.
I think my heart skipped a beat.
I remember you
looking
saying,
at
"Oh my
it."
God."
Because that was the first time that I realized that spirit could have a real physical interaction.
While watching TV one night, Tony reached for the remote control, but it wasn't where he left it. Then, the strong, acrid smell of smoke and chemicals filled the house. He followed the smell to the kitchen, and on the counter was the remote control. Except now, it was partially melted and covered in scorch marks. Fires started breaking out in the house, including one occasion where the window frame of the nursery caught on fire, and then went out as abruptly as it started. Candles around the home would light themselves, and the wax melted up the candles. There was one occasion when a candle had completely melted in its plastic packaging. The wick hadn't been burned, it just looked like something incredibly hot had been pressed up against the candle. The only sign anyone had been near the candle was a child's handprint mysteriously left in the melted wax. One evening, Tony was sat down with Deborah when he felt a sharp pain moving across his chest. He instinctively put his hand to his chest, and when he pulled it away, he screamed out in shock. His fingers were covered in blood. He removed his shirt, and more scratches, deep enough to bleed, appeared on his chest and abdomen. This was the final straw. Although the entity had never shown any aggression to Deborah or the baby, the situation was getting dangerous, and they decided to ask for help. That help came in the form of psychic Barbara Connor, a sister of one of Tony's brother's co-workers who was coming to town for a visit. While walking through the house, she picked up the spirit of a 7-year-old girl called Sallie, who had tragically died in the house. She reassured them that Sallie meant them no harm. In fact, Sallie was a good spirit and was Taylor's guardian angel. In the first few months of Taylor's birth, he'd been woken throughout the night, and this new information convinced Deborah that perhaps Taylor had been born a SIDS baby, and that Sallie constantly waking him had actually saved his life. When asked about Sallie's scratching Tony, Barbara reassured them that even ghost children needed discipline. She suggested they give Sallie a set of rules to follow, and to remember that Sallie just wanted their attention. Barbara told Tony it was particularly important for him to make friends with Sallie, as she had suffered at the hands of a man in life. But it was unlikely that Sallie would leave the house, as she felt safe and secure there. Sometime during the visit, Tony took a picture with his 35mm camera, which later showed a significant and unusual mass on the stairs. Barbara said the colour showed Sallie was a protective spirit. After they learned about the story of Sallie, Deborah attempted to embrace Sallie as a sort of phantom daughter. Tony, however, wanted nothing to do with it, and found the idea of communicating with the dead creepy. In a previous video about Robert the Doll, we discussed how paranormal researchers often advise against giving an unknown entity any kind of permission. The reasons why would soon become clear. The advice given by the psychic only seemed to make things worse. The fires continued, and the strange events escalated. It was during Taylor's birthday party that Tony was alerted to the now all too familiar smell of something burning. He rushed out of the room and found a doll in flames on the stairs. But there was something strange about the fire. The fire seemed restricted to very specific parts of the doll. It wasn't long until Tony was once more the focus of Sally's unwanted attention. On one occasion, when laying on the couch, he felt a painful pinching sensation on his thigh. He jumped up, and when he inspected his leg, there were clear indentations of small teeth, as if bitten by a young child. He called out to Deborah, exclaiming that Sallie had bitten him, but she just reminded him of Barbara's advice to make friends with Sallie. As if to reinforce the point, the scratches continued with more frequency and aggression. It seemed Sallie was determined to make her presence known, and on Halloween she did just that. Tony had just arrived home from a night shift and went to the kitchen for a glass of orange juice, when he was overcome with the feeling he was no longer alone. He turned around and saw a little girl standing in front of him. She looked almost real. Her brown hair was pulled up with a bow that sat atop her head, and he was struck by her enormous blue eyes, contained within a round, pale face. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white lace dress with puffy sleeves, but it was only when he noticed that he could see through her that he realized what he was looking at. The glass fell from his hand and smashed on the floor, and just like that, she disappeared. He stared in disbelief for a few seconds before he ran upstairs to tell Deborah what he saw. It's interesting that Tony was the only one subjected to the scratches and visions. Was this because the entity needed acceptance into the family before it could put its nefarious plan into action? After all, he was the one refusing to accept what was in the house. The apparition of the little girl in the kitchen was the last time Sallie would feature as the main spirit haunting the home. Once it became clear that Tony would not accept the spirit known as Sallie, the insidious nature of the presence would be exposed. The next set of encounters that Tony had suggest that whatever was haunting the home was anything other than a sweet young girl. The first signs that the nature of the haunting was changing was when Tony saw Deborah walking down the hall. She was wearing an old housemaid's outfit with her hair in a bun. He called out to her, but she completely ignored him, and then walked into one of the rooms. But when he followed her into the room, no one was there. Soon, the entity attacks Tony while he's at his most vulnerable. One night, Tony dreams that Sallie grabs him by the wrists and starts dragging him out of bed. He wakes up with a start, then feels a stinging sensation around his wrists. When he looked down, they were covered in blisters, in the shape of a child's hand. The constant nightmares start to take a toll on Tony, and he starts taking more naps to catch up on his sleep. One time, while trying to nap, he sees dust particles in the air behaving strangely. The particles slowly clump together and form into the shape of an older woman dressed in black. As she nears him, the door slams shut. The dressers open and close, and the mattress starts to shake. She reaches for his neck and growls,
"I'm gonna."
Just as he thinks she's about to strangle him, a giant black bird appears in front of him, and the woman's gone. He leapt out of bed, screaming for Deborah and desperately trying to open the door. But it won't open. When he finally opens the door, he finds Deborah in the room across the hall. She didn't hear a thing. The final confirmation of the insidious nature of the haunting was when he saw a little girl approaching him as he lay in bed. There was something about this girl that told him she was different to the usual apparitions of Sallie. The girl reached towards him a number of times as she neared him, but he kept backing away. To his horror, the girl suddenly released a low, guttural growl and slowly transformed into something else. She hunched over on all fours, and her melted flesh was replaced by blood, worms, and gore. It was during this time Tony and Deborah received a call from the television show Sightings. The producer had heard about the haunting from Barbara Connor and wanted to travel to Kansas to film the phenomena. Tony was apprehensive about appearing on the show for fear of ridicule, but was desperate for someone to help. What the Sightings team captured during their investigation catapulted the haunting into nationwide infamy, but it would come at a horrific cost to the Pickman family. The investigating team was skeptical at first, but as soon as filming started, it was clear that this was different. On the first day of filming, an unseen force left deep bloody scratches on Tony's arm while Deborah was being interviewed.
As Pamela waited for the noise to stop, Jeff called out.
Is it going?
She don't like everybody here, did.
Sallie, stop it.
Some of the crew remained skeptical, but in the middle of Tony's interview, he was scratched again, this time on his stomach. There is 9-minute footage of the scratches spontaneously appearing on his skin. A psychic on the paranormal team sensed the spirit of a young girl present in the house.
I got just a glimpse of that upper window of the face of a little girl. And I don't know who lives here. It's a boy, right? But I saw the face of a little girl in that window just now.
They were amazed when he went on to correctly identify the name of the spirit as Sallie.
There's a little girl that's standing right there.
Hello? Can you speak to me? Sallie? Is that your name, Sallie? Sallie? Okay.
But he also sensed the presence of a middle-aged woman. Every time the paranormal team returned, the scratches, visions and sounds Tony were experiencing intensified. To make sure Tony wasn't doing the scratches to himself, the crew checked him for scratches before he was going to be alone. During one point in the investigation, the crew saw mysterious welts forming on his forehead, and the initials MC were scratched on his body during filming.
Remember, you're in control here, so don't.
MC.
Ooh.
I heard that electrical shock.
Yes, let me just, right here, right in my hand.
It's a strange coincidence, as these are the first initials Michael C. Finney, who built the home. The presence of the investigating team increased the activity to unprecedented levels. It was like the entity was feeding off the energy of those present. Over the course of one night of filming, Tony was attacked 11 separate times. By the time they had finished, he was covered in welts and scratches. This all happened in front of a parapsychologist who said that in all his career, he'd never seen anything like this before. Now, before we move on with the story, this next chapter contains descriptions of animal cruelty. If you want to skip this next chapter, then please do. He'd been hearing voices for months. In the beginning, he couldn't make out what they were saying, but now he could. They were telling him to do terrible things, like hurting his wife, or worse. Every time Deborah walked past him, he felt an overwhelming urge to harm her in some way, and started having intensely vivid dreams of cutting her throat.
All I could think about was evil thoughts. This isn't me. Why am I thinking this way? I would get a real strong sense of hate. All I could think was, I just want to hurt her.
One morning, after coming home from work, Tony walked into the kitchen and saw the cat eaten out its bowl. He suddenly found himself overcome with a rage and hatred unlike anything he'd ever felt before. That was when he felt the knife in his hand. And that was when he blacked out. Later that day, he returned home from visiting his parents and found blood all over the kitchen. On the counter was the family cat, stabbed to death and pinned to the kitchen counter with a butcher's knife. He didn't remember killing the cat, but this was a wake-up call for Tony. He knew that if he didn't do something soon, Deborah might be next, or even their child. He tried telling Deborah how bad things were getting, but she still believed that Sallie was a protective spirit and was so fascinated by the phenomena going on, she didn't see the danger she was in.
Friends and relatives that do know of our situation ask, and I'm sure probably every one of your television viewers ask, is why do you stay here? Why don't you just get out? What holds you there? Curiosity. There needs to be more data so that we can know what exactly this is, what causes it. Why do these things happen to certain people, certain places, certain times?
Later, Tony was pushed into the staircase so hard that he broke 3 railings and almost went over the banister and down the stairs. This was the event that finally convinced Deborah that they needed to leave, and within 3 weeks they were out of her house. Looking back, Deborah says her reactions don't make any sense to her now, but at the time she was so wrapped up in the idea of her newborn son having a guardian angel that she completely ignored any evidence to the contrary. She believes that whatever was in the house was using her maternal instincts to manipulate her. It made her completely indifferent to the abuse being suffered by her husband, and remains something she's never been able to forgive herself for. One question is why Tony was targeted. He says it was simply because he was the weaker person in the house, but it may have been because he was the most resistant. The experiences Tony suffered grew in intensity the more he refused to accept Sallie into their lives. A woman moved in after the Pickmans, but a short time later she was evicted following reports of her trashing the house. When the landlord inspected the property, he found strange markings and a pentagram painted in the floor of the basement. The woman who lived there had very few possessions and appeared to be using the house for ritualistic purposes to communicate with something demonic. But most disturbing of all was the discovery of blood splatter in the closet of the master bedroom. It's never been confirmed whose blood it belonged to. There have been countless paranormal investigations at the Sallie House, which have captured some of the most compelling evidence ever documented. Zach Bagans, the host of Ghost Adventures, brought Deborah and Tony Pickman back to the house as part of their investigation. And in addition to capturing an EVP, which sounded like a young girl's voice saying, "I'm Sallie," Tony once more experienced welts appearing on his neck, and other guests received scratches. In addition to Sallie, there have been multiple reports of the spirit of an angry middle-aged woman in the house. During my research for this episode, I found evidence of a tragedy that directly involved a middle-aged woman named Joanna Barnes and Dr. Michael Charles Finney, who built the Sallie House. Joanna Barnes had been institutionalized for being violently insane and was moved into the house next door and into the care of Dr. Finney. It seems that Joanna never recovered. In fact, there's a good chance she was made worse by the care she received, because in 1906 she turned on the gas stove and lay down with her youngest child, Frank, who was 5 at the time. They were both overcome by the fumes, but while Joanna survived, Frank did not. The strange activity taking place in the Sallie House shows no sign of stopping. Of all the evidence captured, the EVP I'm about to play you is one of the most compelling I've ever heard. It was captured by the Astonishing Legends team during an investigation into the Sallie House in 2018. It takes a lot to freak me out, but something about this EVP genuinely scared me the first time I heard it. And even now, I can't listen to it without my hair standing up. This recording has been known to cause traumatic reactions in those that hear it. So listen at your own risk.
Okay. File 10, putting this down. I'm going to leave this here for about 5 minutes. If there's anything you want to say, any message you would like to share with the world, leave it on this recorder, and we will share it. Leaving now, closing the door. No one else is in this room this time. Back into the room. Going to take the recorder. Thank you for your time. Wishing you peace.